If you stay in a cabin in the middle of the woods, you are bound to hear some strange, unnerving noises coming from the wilderness at night. Alternatively, you might hear nothing but eerie silence as you lie down in bed, trying to go to sleep, though sleep seems impossible when you're out here all alone, defenseless, in a strange, wild area you've never been before. Sometimes you might come into contact with an unwelcome visitor who emerges from the woods. This visitor could be a wild animal, like a bear. It could be a creature, like a Sasquatch, or an extraterrestrial visitor, or even a ghost. But sometimes people have strange encounters in the woods while staying in a cabin that don't really fit into that category. The following account is from a logbook in a National Park Service cabin in southeastern Alaska. The encounter is very strange in that it does not take place at night. It takes place first thing in the morning. And the visitor is not someone dangerous or particularly frightening, but someone who holds a secret. A very strange but fascinating secret that seems to land him in trouble, as the pages in the logbook entry have been shot with bullets, it appears, and a crucial part of the logbook entry has been torn out, as if certain government officials don't want certain information getting out there. So, without further ado, let's examine this very strange, very odd encounter and see what we can make of it. The following was written on January 16th through January 17th, 2007, when this visitor was staying in a cabin in the Alaskan wilderness. We had a most remarkable visit here. What we planned as a quiet retreat to this wild spot turned into a memorable view of our technological future. Just as we were getting coffee water going and putting on dry clothes, we heard some rustling sounds out by the woodshed. I looked out the window and saw a thin older man picking small pieces of firewood out of the stack. I went out to see what he was up to, and that's when I noticed the breathtakingly modern-looking craft tied to the dock. It looked to be a cross between an ultralight airplane and a hot air balloon. While I stared at this thing, all shiny-sided and tight with light wires connecting the sections, the man approached me. He was very soft-spoken and polite. He apologized for intruding on our privacy, but asked if we would mind his taking a bit of fuel for his trip. Of course, I had no idea what he was talking about, so I invited him in for coffee. While having a cup of coffee, and later cheese blitzes and scones with thimbleberry marmalade, he told me his story. He worked for the Air Force and later in the Pentagon as a procurement/development specialist. While doing so, he became enamored of the potential for the use of ultralight materials for air and watercraft. He became so enthusiastic about these new technologies that eventually he ran afoul of the representatives of the huge military providers, Boeing and Lockheed, as well as others. Apparently, this fellow had become an advocate for development techniques that would revolutionize aircraft design, making planes cheaper and more readily constructed, even by home builders and third-world consumers. Each innovation would bankrupt the large military contractors, who would lose their monopolies. After a series of near accidents, and after he found himself shunned and ignored by the Pentagon and his peers, he realized that the developments he so favored would not soon see the light of day. When he perceived that he was being followed night and day, he knew it was time to move on. So that's how he came to Alaska Lake. For the last 7.5 years, he's wandered the northern hemisphere traveling in the remarkable craft. He said he propels it forward by aligning the wings, much like you'd sail a sailboat, actually moving forward against a headwind. And to keep aloft, he brings a very small amount of fuel. Thus, he stopped here for some wood. He only took about 10 kilos of split wood, about as much as he could carry. By carefully holding in the heated air from the combustion of the wood in what looked like some large nylon balloons, he was able to maximize the lift he produced. He said that the small amount of fuel would probably be enough to get him to Windham Bay, or the mainland halfway between Juneau and Petersburg, his next planned stopping point. He was so enthusiastic about his craft and his concepts, I asked him why he didn't patent them and sell them for millions. He said that virtually all the developments he'd come up with were achieved while he was working for the government, so they really weren't his to patent. The one time he'd stayed near a town long enough to set up correspondence with the U.S. Patent Office to get a patent on one of his recent developments, he narrowly escaped being arrested by a half-dozen men who arrived at his campsite hotel at night in armored vehicles. If he hadn't stepped away from his campfire to take a leak, they'd have had him for sure. As it turned out, he was outside the arc of light cast by his campfire when the black-clad men crept into sight. Since then, he'd been on the move. As to making money on his ideas, he said that's not important to him. He's eager for his designs to spread throughout the world. And he let me make some sketches of his craft. I will put them neatly below. After a pleasant morning with this man, who politely refused to give us his name, he lifted off as quietly as he'd arrived and was gone. We won't forget him soon. Here's what his craft looks like. And here the page is ripped. So if we take this as the truth, we might assume that some government agent came to the cabin and ripped out this part of the page because they didn't want anyone finding out what the secret craft looked like. And the fact that there are apparent bullet holes in the page seems to indicate that there was some sort of struggle between whatever government agent might have come to the cabin and whoever was staying there. If that was the case, then in my opinion, this is more disturbing than having a paranormal encounter out in the cabin in the woods. Because if this is true, what could it mean, this ripped out page and these bullet holes, other than the people who were staying at the cabin were killed because they knew too much? Then again, this all might be a hoax. I just thought this was interesting, and I will definitely link in the description where I found it. It could be that someone simply wrote all this down on a notepad and then took a picture of it and then faked the bullet holes and ripped out the page themselves and put this on Reddit to fool people. That is definitely a possibility. It's still unnerving, nonetheless. I will say there are some details that I found interesting. For instance, the people staying at the cabin, they use kilos instead of pounds as a measurement for weight, and that made me think that they are not from the United States. Perhaps they are more trusting of the government than your typical American would be, and that is why they wrote all of this down, not realizing the consequences. There's also the fact that they reference Alaska Lake, even though there is no Alaska Lake in Alaska. There is one in Washington State, but not in Alaska itself. So that might indicate that this was a hoax and someone didn't do their research when making this hoax, or the people in the cabin are real and they were somehow mistaken about what lake they were near. Or it could be that I simply misinterpreted this word right before lake because the cursive is a little bit hard to read, so it might not be Alaska Lake after all. Who really knows? But those are my thoughts on this. Like I said, I just thought it was interesting, and it is quite disturbing. So I hope you enjoyed this little video about this strange little internet artifact that I discovered. Thank you guys. Stay safe out there. And if someone takes your logs while you're staying at a remote cabin, maybe don't speak to them, because you might end up in trouble. And remember, don't get scared out of sorts.